Relax and listen to the voice. Welcome to the Fairy Tales of Hans Christian Andersen. This is volume 27. This volume is filled with one long story and quite a few short stories, which will be a nice break from the longer stories in the recent episodes. Do us a favor, like the videos, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share it with your family and friends. Alright, with that, here we go. Lisbeth. Lisbeth was a beautiful young woman with a red and white complexion, glittering white teeth, and clear, soft eyes, and her footstep was light in the dance, but her mind was lighter still. She had a little child, not at all pretty, so he was put out to be nursed by a laborer's wife, and his mother went to the Count's castle. She sat in splendid rooms, richly decorated with silk and velvet. Not a breath of air was allowed to be blown upon her, and no one was allowed to speak to her harshly, for she was nurse to the Count's child. He was fair and delicate as a prince, and beautiful as an angel, and how she loved this child. Her own boy was provided for by being at the laborer's where the mouth watered more frequently than the pot boiled, and where, in general, no one was at home to take care of the child. Then he would cry, but what nobody knows, nobody cares for, so he would cry till he was tired, and then fall asleep. And while we are asleep, we can feel neither hunger nor thirst. Ah, yes, sleep. Sleep is a capital invention. As the years went on, Lisbeth's child grew apace like weeds, although they said his growth had been stunted. He had become quite a member of the family in which he dwelt. They received money to keep him, so that his mother got rid of him altogether. She had become quite a lady. She had a comfortable home of her own in the town, and out of doors, when she went for a walk, she wore a bonnet, but she never walked out to see the laborer. That was too far from the town, and indeed she had nothing to go for. The boy now belonged to these laboring people. He had food, and he could also do something towards earning his living. He took care of Mary's red cow, for he knew how to tend cattle and make himself useful. The great dog, by the yard gate of a nobleman's mansion, sits proudly on the top of his kennel when the sun shines, and barks at everyone that passes. But if it rains, he creeps into his house, and there he is warm and dry. Lisbeth's boy also sat in the sunshine on top of the fence, cutting out a little toy. If it was springtime, he knew of 3 strawberry plants in blossom, which would certainly bear fruit. This was his most hopeful thought, though it often came to nothing, and he had to sit out in the rain in the worst weather and get wet to the skin and let the cold wind dry the clothes on his back afterwards. If he went near the farmyard belonging to the Count, he was pushed and knocked about, for the men and the maids said he was so horrible ugly, but he was used to all this, for nobody loved him. This was how the world treated Lisbeth's boy, and how could it be otherwise? It was his fate to be loved by no one. Hitherto, he had been a land crab. The land at last cast him adrift. He went to sea in a wretched vessel, and sat at the helm, while the skipper sat over the grog can. He was dirty and ugly, half frozen and half starved. He always looked as if he never had enough to eat, which really was the case. Late in the autumn, when the weather was rough, windy, and wet, and the cold penetrated through the thickest clothing, especially at sea, a wretched boat went out to sea with only 2 men on board, or, more correctly, a man and a half, for it was the skipper and his boy. There had only been a kind of twilight all day, and it soon grew quite dark, and so bitterly cold that the skipper took a dram to warm him. The bottle was old, and the glass too. It was perfect in the upper part, but the foot was broken off, and it had therefore been fixed upon a little carved block of wood, painted blue. A dram is a great comfort, and two are better still, thought the skipper, while the boy sat at the helm, which he held fast in his hard, seamed hands. He was ugly, and his hair was matted, and he looked crippled and stunted. They called him the field laborer's boy, though in the church register he was entered as Anne Lisbeth's son. The wind cut through the rigging, and the boat cut through the sea. The sails, filled by the wind, swelled out and carried them along in wild career. It was wet and rough above and below, and might still be worse. Hold! What is that? What has struck the boat? Was it a waterspout, or a heavy sea rolling suddenly upon them? "Heaven help us!" cried the boy at the helm, as the boat heeled over and lay on its beam ends. It had struck a rock, which rose from the depths of the sea, and sank at once, like an old shoe in a puddle. It sank at once with mouse and man, as the saying is. There might have been mice on board, but only one man and a half, the skipper and the laborer's boy. No one saw it but the skimming seagulls and the fishes beneath the water, and even they did not see it properly, for they darted back with terror as the boat filled with water and sank. There it lay, scarcely a fathom below the surface, and those two were provided for, buried, and forgotten. The glass with the foot of blue wood was the only thing that did not sink, for the wood floated, and the glass drifted away to be cast upon the shore and broken. Where and when is indeed of no consequence. It had served its purpose, and it had been loved, which Anne Lisbeth's boy had not been. But in heaven, no soul will be able to say, "Never loved." Anne Lisbeth had now lived in the town many years. She was called Madame, and felt dignified in consequence. She remembered the old noble days in which she had driven in a carriage and had associated with Countess and Baroness. Her beautiful, noble child had been a dear angel, and possessed the kindest heart. He had loved her so much, and she had loved him in return. They had kissed and loved each other, and the boy had been her joy, her second life. Now he was 14 years of age, tall, handsome, and clever. She had not seen him since she carried him in her arms, neither had she been for years to the Count's palace. It was quite a journey thither from town.
"I must make one effort to go,"
said Anne Lisbeth,
"to see my darling, the Count's sweet child, and press him to my heart. Certainly he must long to see me, too, the young Count. No doubt he thinks of me and loves me, as in those days when he would fling his angel arms round my neck and lisp, 'Anne Liz.' It was music to my ears. Yes, I must make an effort to see him again."
She drove across the country in the grazier's cart, and then got out and continued her journey on foot, and thus reached the Count's castle. It was as great and magnificent as it had always been, and the garden looked the same as ever. All the servants were strangers to her. Not one of them knew Anne Lisbeth, nor of what consequence she had once been there, but she felt sure the Countess would soon let them know it, and her darling boy too. How she longed to see him! Now that Anne Lisbeth was at her journey's end, she was kept waiting a long time, and for those who wait, time passes slowly. But before the great people went in to dinner, she was called in and spoken to very graciously. She was to go in again after dinner, and then she would see her sweet boy once more. How tall and slender and thin he had grown, but the eyes and the sweet angel mouth were still beautiful. He looked at her, but he did not speak. He certainly did not know who she was. He turned round and was going away, but she seized his hand and pressed it to her lips. "Well, well," he said, and with that he walked out of the room. He who filled her every thought, he whom she loved best, and who was her whole earthly pride. And Lisbeth went forth from the castle into the public road, feeling mournful and sad. He whom she had nursed day and night, and even now carried about in her dreams, had been cold and strange, and had not a word or thought respecting her. A great black raven darted down in front of her on the high road, and croaked dismally.
"Ah, ah,"
she said.
"what bird of ill omen art thou?"
Presently she passed the laborer's hut. His wife stood at the door, and the two women spoke to each other.
"You look well,"
said the woman.
"You're fat and plump. You are well off." "Oh, yes,"
answered Aunt Lisbeth.
"The boat went down with them,"
continued the woman.
"Hans, the skipper, and the boy were both drowned, so there's an end of them. I always thought the boy would be able to help me with a few dollars. He'll never cost you anything more, Aunt Lisbeth." "So they were drowned?"
repeated Aunt Lisbeth, but she said no more, and the subject was dropped. She felt very low-spirited, because her Count child had shown no inclination to speak to her who loved him so well, and who had traveled so far to see him. The journey had cost money, too, and she had derived no great pleasure from it. Still, she said not a word of all this. She could not relieve her heart by telling the laborer's wife, lest the latter should think she did not enjoy her former position at the castle. Then the raven flew over her, screaming again as he flew.
"The black wretch,"
said Aunt Lisbeth.
"He will end by frightening me today."
She had brought coffee and chicory with her, for she thought it would be a charity to the poor woman to give them to her to boil a cup of coffee, and then she would take a cup herself. The woman prepared the coffee, and in the meantime Aunt Lisbeth seated in her chair and fell asleep. Then she dreamed of something which she had never dreamed before. Singularly enough, she dreamed of her own child, who had wept and hungered in the laborer's hut, and had been knocked about in heat and cold, and who was now lying in the depths of the sea, in a spot only known by God. She fancied she was still sitting in the hut, where the woman was busy preparing the coffee, for she could smell the coffee berries roasting. But suddenly it seemed to her that there stood on the threshold a beautiful young form, as beautiful as the Count's child, and this apparition said to her,
"The world is passing away. Hold fast to me, for you are my mother after all. You have an angel in heaven. Hold me fast."
And the child angel stretched out his hand and seized her. Then there was a terrible crash, as of a world crumbling to pieces, and the angel child was rising from the earth and holding her by the sleeve so tightly that she felt herself lifted from the ground. But, on the other hand, something heavy hung to her feet and dragged her down, and it seemed as if hundreds of women were clinging to her and crying,
"If thou art to be saved, we must be saved too. Hold fast, hold fast."
And then they all hung on her, but there were too many. And as they clung, the sleeve was torn, and Aunt Lisbeth fell down in horror and awoke. Indeed, she was on the point of falling over in reality with the chair on which she sat. but she was so startled and alarmed that she could not remember what she had dreamed, only that it was something very dreadful. They drank their coffee and had a chat together, and then Lisbeth went away towards the little town where she was to meet the carrier who was to drive her back to her own home. But when she came to him, she found that he would not be ready to start till the next evening of the next day. Then she began to think of the expense and what the distance would be to walk. She remembered that the route by the seashore was 2 miles shorter than by the high road, and as the weather was clear and there would be moonlight, she determined to make her way on foot and to start at once, that she might reach home the next day. The sun had set, and the evening bells sounded through the air from the tower of the village church. But to her it was not the bells, but the cry of the frogs in the marshes. Then they ceased, and all around became still. Not a bird could be heard. They were all at rest. Even the owl had not left her hiding place. Deep silence reigned on the margin of the wood by the seashore. As Lisbeth walked on, she could hear her own footsteps in the sands. Even the waves of the sea were at rest, and all in the deep waters had sunk into silence. There was quiet among the dead and the living in the deep sea. Lisbeth walked on, thinking of nothing at all, as people say, or rather, her thoughts wandered, but not away from her, for thought is never absent from us. It only slumbers. Many thoughts that have lain dormant are roused at the proper time, and begin to stir in the mind and the heart, and seem even to come upon us from above. It is written that a good deed bears a blessing for its fruit, and it is also written that the wages of sin is death. Much has been said, and much written, which we pass over or know nothing of. A light arises within us, and then forgotten things make themselves remembered, and thus it was with Lisbeth. The germ of every vice and every virtue lies in our heart, in yours and in mine. They lie like little grains of seed, till a ray of sunshine, or the touch of an evil hand, or you turn the corner to the right or to the left, and the decision is made. The little seed is stirred. It swells and shoots up, and pours its sap into your blood, directing your course either for good or evil. Troublesome thoughts often exist in the mind, fermenting there, which are not realized by us while the senses are as it were slumbering, but still they are there. Lisbeth walked on, thus with her senses half asleep, but the thoughts were fermenting within her. From one Shrove Tuesday to another, much may occur to weigh down the heart. It is the reckoning of a whole year. Much may be forgotten. Sins against heaven in word and thought, sins against our neighbor and against our own conscience. We are scarcely aware of their existence, and Lisbeth did not think of any of her errors. She had committed no crime against the law of the land. She was an honorable person, in a good position. That she knew. She continued her walk along by the margin of the sea. What was it she saw lying there? An old hat? A man's hat? Now, when might that have been washed overboard? She drew nearer. She stopped to look at the hat. Ha! What was lying yonder? She shuddered, yet it was nothing save a heap of grass and tangled seaweed flung across a long stone. But it looked like a corpse. Only tangled grass, and yet she was frightened at it. As she turned to walk away, much came into her mind that she had heard in her childhood. Old superstitions of specters by the seashore, of the ghost of drowned but unburied people, whose corpses had been washed up on the desolate beach. The body, she knew, could do no harm to anyone, but the spirit could pursue the lonely wanderer, attach itself to him, and demand to be carried to the churchyard, that it might rest in consecrated ground. "Hold fast! Hold fast!" the spectre would cry, and as Anne Lisbeth murmured these words to herself, the whole of her dream was suddenly recalled to her memory, when the mother had clung to her and uttered these words when amid the crashing of worlds her sleeve had been torn and she had slipped from the grasp of her child who wanted to hold her up in that terrible hour. Her child, her own child, which she had never loved, lay now buried in the sea, and might rise up like a spectre from the waters and cry,
"Hold fast! Carry me to consecrated ground!"
As these thoughts passed through her mind, fear gave speed to her feet, so that she walked faster and faster. Fear came upon her as if a cold, clammy hand had been laid upon her heart, so that she almost fainted. As she looked across the sea, all there grew darker. A heavy mist came rolling onwards and clung to bush and tree, distorting them into fantastic shapes. She turned and glanced at the moon, which had risen behind her. It looked like a pale, rayless surface, and a deadly weight seemed to hang upon her limbs.
"Hold,"
thought she, and then she turned round a second time to look at the moon. A white face appeared quite close to her, with a mist hanging like a garment from its shoulders.
"Stop! Carry me to consecrated earth!"
sounded in her ears in strange, hollow tones. The sound did not come from frogs or ravens. She saw no sign of such creatures.
"A grave! Dig me a grave!"
was repeated quite loud. Yes, it was indeed the spectre of her child, the child that lay beneath the ocean, and whose spirit could have no rest until it was carried to the churchyard, and until a grave had been dug for it in consecrated ground. She would go there at once, and there she would dig. She turned in the direction of the church, and the weight on her heart seemed to grow lighter, and even to vanish altogether. But when she turned to go home by the shortest way, it returned.
"Stop! Stop!"
And the words came quite clear, though they were like the croak of a frog or the wail of a bird.
"A grave! Dig me a grave!"
The mist was cold and damp. Her hands and face were moist and clammy with horror. A heavy weight again seized her and clung to her. Her mind became clear for thoughts that had never before been there. In these northern regions, a beechwood often buds in a single night and appears in the morning sunlight in its full glory of youthful green. So, in a single instant, can the consciousness of the sin that has been committed in thoughts, words, and actions of our past life be unfolded to us. When once the conscious is awakened, it springs up in the heart spontaneously, and God awakens the conscience when we least expect it. Then we can find no excuse for ourselves. The deed is there and bears witness against us. The thoughts seem to become words and to sound far out into the world. We are horrified at the thought of what we have carried within us, and at the consciousness that we have not overcome the evil which has its origin in thoughtlessness and pride. The heart conceals within itself the vices as well as the virtues, and they grow in the shallowest ground. Anne Lisbeth now experienced in thought what we have clothed in words. She was overpowered by them, and sank down and crept along for some distance on the ground.
"A grave! Dig me a grave!"
sounded again in her ears, and she would have gladly buried herself if in the grave she could have found forgetfulness of her actions. It was the first hour of her awakening, full of anguish and horror. Superstition made her alternately shudder with cold or burn with the heat of fever. Many things, of which she had feared even to speak, came into her mind. Silently, as the cloud shadows in the moonshine, a spectral apparition flitted by her. She had heard of it before. Close by her galloped 4 snorting steeds with fire flashing from their eyes and nostrils. They dragged a burning coach, and within it sat the wicked lord of the manor, who had ruled there 100 years before. The legend says that every night at 12 o'clock he drove into his castle yard and out again. He was not as pale as dead men are, but black as coal. He nodded and pointed to Aunt Lisbeth, crying out,
"Hold fast! Hold fast! And then you may ride again in the nobleman's carriage and forget your child."
She gathered herself up and hastened to the churchyard, but black crosses and black ravens danced before her eyes, and she could not distinguish one from the other. The ravens croaked as the raven had done, which she saw in the daytime, but now she understood what they said.
"I am the Raven Mother! I am the Raven Mother!"
Each raven croaked, and Aunt Lisbeth felt that the name also applied to her, and she fancied she should be transformed into a black bird and have to cry as they cried if she did not dig the grave. And she threw herself upon the earth, and with her hands dug a grave in the hard ground, so that the blood ran from her fingers.
"A grave! Dig me a grave!"
still sounded in her ears. She was fearful that the cock might crow, and the first red streak appear in the east before she had finished her work, and then she would be lost. And the cock crowed, and the day dawned in the east, and the grave was only half dug. An icy hand passed over her head and face, and down towards her heart.
"Only half a grave!"
A voice wailed, and then fled away. Yes, it fled away over the sea. It was the ocean spectre. Exhausted and overpowered, Aunt Lisbeth sunk to the ground, and her senses left her. It was a bright day when she came to herself, and 2 men were raising her up, but she was not lying in the churchyard, but on the seashore, where she had dug a deep hole in the sand, and cut her hand with a piece of broken glass, whose sharp stern was stuck in a little block of painted wood. Aunt Lisbeth was in a fever. Conscience had roused the memories of superstitions, and had so acted upon her mind that she fancied she had only half a soul, and that her child had taken the other half down into the sea. Never would she be able to cling to the mercy of heaven till she had recovered his other half, which was now held fast in the deep water. Aunt Lisbeth returned to her home, but she was no longer the woman she had been. Her thoughts were like a confused, tangled skein. Only one thought was clear to her, namely, that she must carry the spectre of the seashore to the churchyard and dig a grave for him there, that by so doing she might win back her soul. Many a night she was missed from her home, and was always found on the seashore, waiting for the spectre. In this way a whole year passed, and then one night she vanished again, and was not to be found. The whole of the next day was spent in a useless search after her. Towards evening, when the clerk entered the church to toll the vesper bell, he saw by the altar Aunt Lisbeth, who had spent the whole day there. Her powers of body were almost exhausted, but her eyes flashed brightly, and on her cheeks was a rosy flush. The last rays of the setting sun shone upon her, and gleamed over the altar upon the shining clasps of the Bible, which lay open at the words of the prophet Joel. "Rend your hearts, and not your garments, and turn unto the Lord." That was just a chance, the people said. But do things happen by chance? In the face of Lisbeth, lighted up by the evening sun, could be seen peace and rest. She said she was happy now, for she had conquered. The spectre of the shore, her own child, had come to her the night before and had said to her,
"Thou hast dug me only half a grave, but thou hast now, for a year and a day, buried me altogether in thy heart, and it is there a mother can best hide her child."
And then he gave her back her lost soul and brought her into the church.
"Now I am in the house of God,"
she said,
"and in that house we are happy."
When the sun set, Lisbeth's soul had risen to that region where there is no more pain, and Lisbeth's troubles were at an end. Two brothers. On one of the Danish islands where old thingstones, the seats of justice of our forefathers, still stand in the cornfields, and huge trees rise in the forests of beech, there lies a little town whose low houses are covered with red tiles. In one of these houses, strange things were brewing over the glowing coals on the open hearth. There was a boiling going on in glasses, and a mixing and a stilling, while herbs were being cut up and pounded into mortars. An elderly man looked after it all.
"One must only do the right thing,"
he said.
"Yes, the correct thing. One must find out the truth concerning every created particle, and to keep that."
In the room with the good housewife sat her two sons. They were still small, but had great thoughts. Their mother, too, had always spoken to them of right and justice, and exhorted them to keep the truth, which she said was the countenance of the Lord in this world. The elder of the boys looked roguish and enterprising. He took a delight in reading of the forces of nature, of the sun and of the moon. No fairy tale pleased him so much. Oh, how beautiful it must be, he thought, to go on voyages of discovery, or to find out how to imitate the wings of birds, and then to be able to fly. Yes, to find that out was the right thing. Father was right, and Mother was right. Truth holds the world together. The younger brother was quieter, and buried himself entirely in his books. When he read about Jacob dressing himself in sheepskins to personify Esau and to usurp his brother's birthright, he would clench his little fists in anger against the deceiver. When he read of tyrants and of the injustice and wickedness of the world, tears would come into his eyes, and he was quite filled with the thought of the justice and truth which must and would triumph. One evening he was lying in bed, but the curtains were not yet drawn closed, and the light streamed in upon him. He had taken his book into bed with him, for he wanted to finish reading the story of Solomon. His thoughts lifted and carried him away a wonderful distance. It seemed to him as if the bed had become a ship flying along under full sail. Was he dreaming, or was this happening? It glided over the rolling waves and across the ocean of time, and to him came the voice of Solomon, spoken in a strange tongue, yet intelligible to him. He heard the Danish motto, "By law the land is ruled." The genius of the human race stood in the humble room, bent down over the bed, and imprinted a kiss on the boy's forehead. "Be thou strong in fame, and strong in the battle of life. With truth in thy heart, Fly toward the land of truth. The elder brother was not yet in bed. He was standing at the window, looking out at the mist which rose from the meadows. They were not elves dancing out there, as their old nurse had told him. He knew better. They were vapors which were warmer than the air, and that is why they rose. A shooting star lit up the sky, and the boy's thoughts passed in a second from the vapors of the earth up to the shining meteor. The stars gleamed in the heavens, and it seemed as if long golden threads hung down from them to the earth. "Fly with me," sang a voice which the boy heard in his heart. And the mighty genius of mankind, swifter than a bird and an arrow, swifter than anything of earthly origin, carried him out into space, where the heavenly bodies are bound together by the rays that pass from star to star. Our earth revolved in the thin air, and the cities upon it seemed to lie close to each other. Through the spheres echoed the words, "What is near? What is far, when thou art lifted by the mighty genius of mind?" And again the boy stood by the window gazing out, whilst his younger brother lay in bed. Their mother called them by their names, Anders Sando and Hans Christian. Denmark and the whole world knows them, the two brothers Ørsted. The Pen and the Inkstand. In a poet's room where his inkstand stood on the table, the remark was once made, "It is wonderful what can be brought out of an inkstand. What will come next? It is indeed wonderful."
"Yes, certainly,"
said the inkstand to the pen, and to the other articles that stood on the table.
"That's what I always say. It is wonderful and extraordinary what a number of things come out of me. It's quite incredible, and I really don't know what is coming next when that man dips his pen into me. One drop out of me is enough for half a page of paper, and what cannot half a page contain? From me all the works of a poet are produced. All those imaginary characters whom people fancy they have known or met. All the deep feeling, the humor, and the vivid pictures of nature. I myself don't understand how it is, for I am not acquainted with nature, but it is certainly in me. From me have gone forth to the world those wonderful descriptions of troops of charming maidens and of brave knights on prancing steeds, of the halt and the blind, and I know not what more, for I assure you I never think of these things."
"There you are right," said the pen, "for you don't think at all. If you did, you would see that you can only provide the means. You give the fluid that I may place upon the paper what dwells in me, and what I wish to bring to light. It is the pen that writes. No man doubts that, and indeed, most people understand as much about poetry as an old inkstand."
"You have had very little experience,"
replied the inkstand.
"You have hardly been in service a week, and are already half worn out. Do you imagine you're a poet? You are only a servant, and before you I had many like you, some of the goose family, and others of English manufacture. I know a quill pen as well as I know a steel one. I have had both sorts in my service, and I shall have many more when he comes, the man who performs the mechanical part, and writes down what he obtains from me. I should like to know what will be the next thing he gets out of me."
"Inkpot!" exclaimed the pen contemptuously. Late in the evening, the poet came home. He had been to a concert and had been quite enchanted with the admirable performance of a famous violin player whom he had heard there. The performer had produced from his instrument a richness of tone that sometimes sounded like tinkling water drops or rolling pearls, sometimes like the birds twittering in chorus, and then rising and swelling in sound like the wind through the fir trees. The poet felt as if his own heart were weeping, but in tones of melody, like the sound of a woman's voice. It seemed not only the strings, but every part of the instrument from which these sounds were produced. It was a wonderful performance and a difficult piece, and yet the bow seemed to glide across the strings so easily that it was as if anyone could do it who tried. Even the violin and the bow appeared to perform independently of their master who guided them. It was as if soul and spirit had been breathed into the instrument, so the audience forgot the performer in the beautiful sounds he produced. Not so the poet. He remembered him, and named him, and wrote down his thoughts on the subject. How foolish it would be for the violin and the bow to boast of their performance, and yet we men often commit that folly. The poet, the artist, the man of science in his laboratory, the general, we all do it, and yet we are only the instruments which the Almighty uses. To him alone the honor is due. We have nothing of ourselves of which we should be proud. Yes, this is what the poet wrote down. He wrote it in the form of a parable, and called it The Master and the Instruments.
"This is what you have got, madame,"
said the pen to the inkstand when the two were alone again.
"Did you hear him read aloud what I had written down?"
Yes, what I gave you to write,
retorted the inkstand.
That was a cut at you because of your conceit. To think that you could not understand that you were being quizzed. I gave you a cut from within me. Surely I must know my own satire.
"Ink pitcher!"
cried the pen.
Writing stick!
retorted the inkstand, and each of them felt satisfied that he had given a good answer. It is pleasing to be convinced that you have settled a matter by your reply. It is something to make you sleep well, and they both slept well upon it, but the poet did not sleep. Thoughts rose up within him like the tones of the violin falling on the pearls, or rushing like the strong wind through the forest. He understood his own heart in these thoughts, and they were as a ray from the mind of the great master of all minds. To him be all the honor. The Farmyard Cock and the Weathercock. There were two cocks, one on the dunghill, the other on the roof. They were both arrogant, but which of the two rendered most service? Tell us your opinion. We'll keep ours just the same, though. The poultry yard was divided by some planks from another yard in which there was a dunghill, and on the dunghill lay and grew a large cucumber which was conscious of being a hotbed plant.
One is born to that,
said the cucumber to itself.
Not all can be born cucumbers. There must be other things too. The hens, the ducks, and all the animals in the next yard are creatures too. Now I have a great opinion of the yard cock on the plank. He is certainly of much more importance than the weathercock who is placed so high and can't even creak, much less crow. The latter has neither hens nor chicks, and only thinks of himself and perspires verdigris. No, the yardcock is really a cock. His step is a dance, his crowing is music, and wherever he goes, one knows what a trumpeter is like. If he would only come in here, even if he ate me up, stump, stock, and all, and I had to dissolve in his body, it would be a happy death,
said the cucumber. In the night there was a terrible storm. The hens, chicks, and even the cock sought shelter. The wind tore down the planks between the 2 yards with a crash. The tiles came tumbling down, but the weathercock sat firm. He did not even turn round, for he could not, and yet he was young and freshly cast, but prudent and sedate. He had been born old, and did not at all resemble the birds flying in the air, the sparrows and the swallows. No, he despised them. These mean little piping birds, these common whistlers. He admitted that the pigeons, large and white and shining like mother-o'-pearl, looked like a kind of weathercock, but they were fat and stupid, and all their thoughts and endeavors were directed to filling themselves with food. And besides, they were tiresome things to converse with. The birds of passage had also paid the weathercock a visit and told him of foreign countries, of airy caravans, and robber stories that made one's hair stand on end. All this was new and interesting, that is, for the first time, but afterwards, as the weathercock found out, they repeated themselves and always told the same stories, and that's very tedious, and there was no one with whom one could associate, for one and all were stale and small-minded.
"The world is no good," he said. "Everything in it is so stupid."
The weathercock was puffed up, and that quality would have made him interesting in the eyes of the cucumber if it had known it. But it had eyes only for the yardcock, who was now in the yard with it. The wind had blown the planks, but the storm was over.
"What do you think of that crowing?" said the yardcock to the hens and chickens. "It was a little rough. It wanted elegance."
And the hens and chickens came up on the dunghill, and the cock strutted about like a lord.
"Garden plant?"
he said to the cucumber, and in that one word his deep learning showed itself, and it forgot that he was pecking at her and eating it up.
A happy death.
The hens and the chickens came, for where one runs, the others run too. They clucked and chirped, and looked at the cock, and were proud that he was their kind.
"Cock-a-doodle-doo," he crowed. "The chickens will grow up into great hens at once, if I cry it out in the poultry yard of the world."
The hens and chicks clucked and chirped, and the cock announced a great piece of news.
"A cock can lay an egg, and do you know what's in that egg? A basilisk. No one can stand the sight of such a thing. People know that, and now you know it too. You know what is in me, and what a champion of all cocks I am."
With that, the yardcock flapped his wings, made his comb swell up, and crowed again, and they all shuddered, the hens and the little chicks. But they were very proud that one of their number was such a champion of all cocks. They clucked and chirped till the weathercock heard. He heard it, but he did not stir.
"Everything is very stupid,"
the weathercock said to himself.
The yardcock lays no eggs, and I am too lazy to do so. If I liked, I could lay a wind egg, but the world is not worth even a wind egg. Everything is so stupid. I don't want to sit here any longer.
With that, the weathercock broke off, but he did not kill the yardcock, although the hens said that that had been his intention. And what is the moral? Better to crow than to be puffed up and break off. And there we have it, Hans Christian Andersen's Fairy Tales, Volume 27. That felt kind of nice to have a break in those long stories that we've been reading so often recently. We hope that you would also agree with us. Drop us a line and let us know if you had a particular favorite story from this episode. You can do so in the comments or reach out to us by email. Once again, please like this video, subscribe to the channel if you've not done so already, and share this with your family and friends. Let them know that we're here doing this for free for your entertainment. We hope that you take care of each other out there, and we also hope that you have sweet dreams.